I stood there, shaking with a mixture of guilt and indignation, watching my children, my own children, clinging to the woman who had been my husband's rock. Jennifer laid a single lily on Dave's coffin, her eyes brimming with tears that felt more real than any I could summon. She knelt, whispered something I couldn't hear, and then Molly turned to me and said, "You should go, Mom." The words hit like a thunderclap. I had been dethroned, replaced, and exiled in a single breath. For the first time, I realized the family I thought I'd fought to protect was already gone. Because of me. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next one. They said I shouldn't come, but how could I stay away? Rita stood at the edge of the cemetery, clutching a worn leather bag as her eyes scanned the sea of black umbrellas swaying gently under the gray, heavy skies. The soft murmur of prayers and quiet sobs created a somber symphony that seemed to weigh down the very air around her. Despite the drizzle, the mourners stood steadfast, their expressions etched with grief, or at least what appeared to be grief. A photograph of Dave, her husband of 32 years, rested on an easel near the polished oak coffin. His warm smile, forever captured in the prime of his life, felt like an accusation. "Why are you here?" the picture seemed to ask. Rita adjusted her black scarf, attempting to conceal the unease simmering beneath her carefully chosen mourning attire. Her arrival was not welcome, a fact underscored by the cold stares of her 3 children, Molly, Derek, and Anne, who stood shoulder to shoulder near the coffin. Rita had always been their mother, but in this moment, she felt like an interloper at her husband's farewell. Yet, it wasn't their icy reception that unnerved her most. It was the woman standing with them. Jennifer Jardine, Dave's assistant, stood closer to her children than Rita herself dared to. Jennifer's hand rested lightly on Molly's shoulder, offering what looked like comfort. Rita's jaw tightened as the younger woman leaned forward to adjust the flowers on the coffin. The ache in Rita's chest had little to do with grief and everything to do with suspicion. For years, she had suspected that someone was coming between her and Dave. She just hadn't expected the truth to arrive in the form of Jennifer, standing at her husband's funeral like a widow in her own right. Her thoughts swirled, mingling fragments of memory with questions she dared not ask. She remembered the late nights Dave spent at the office, the hurried phone calls he dismissed with a curt, "It's just work." She remembered the way his warmth had gradually faded, replaced by a quiet distance that suffocated their marriage long before he had left this world. Rita's eyes darted to her children. Molly and Derek looked at Jennifer with a fondness that twisted Rita's stomach. Anne, the youngest, glanced toward her mother, her expression unreadable but not kind. "Why is she standing so close to them?" Rita whispered to herself, her voice barely audible beneath the hum of the rain. The question felt heavier than the moment, a crack forming in her mask of composure. Her grip on her bag tightened as a wave of guilt crept in alongside her indignation. For all her suspicions, Rita knew she wasn't blameless. Their marriage had crumbled long before Jennifer had entered the picture. Or had it? She thought of the secrets she herself had kept, the lies she had told to protect her own fragile ego. But whatever her sins, did they justify this? Being pushed aside at her own husband's funeral. Rita took a step closer to the gathering, straining to catch the whispers exchanged among the mourners. "Jennifer's been amazing through all of this," a voice murmured behind her. "She was his rock in those last months." Another responded, barely above a whisper, "You'd think she was his wife." Rita's breath hitched, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Before she could turn to confront the speakers, Jennifer stepped forward. The rain had lightened, and the pastor's closing words filled the air. Jennifer approached the coffin with slow, deliberate steps. She carried a single white lily, its petals pristine against the muted backdrop. Rita watched, her heart pounding, as Jennifer knelt before the coffin, her head bowed. Then Jennifer whispered something. Rita leaned forward, her ears straining to catch the words. "You deserved better than her." The words, soft but unmistakable, pierced Rita's heart. She stumbled backward, her breath shallow. The weight of Jennifer's statement hit like a tidal wave, pulling Rita under a torrent of questions. Who was Jennifer to Dave? As the ceremony concluded, Rita stood frozen, the raindrops blending with the tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. Whatever she thought she knew about her husband, about her marriage, was unraveling before her eyes. The answers she sought would come, but they would shatter her world. The conference room felt suffocating, its dim lighting and sterile decor amplifying the tension in the air. Rita sat stiffly at the head of the long mahogany table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her sat Molly, Derek, and Anne, their expressions somber but guarded. Jack Whitmore, Dave's longtime attorney, cleared his throat as he adjusted his glasses and unfolded the thick document containing the will. As per Dave's wishes, Jack began, his voice measured and steady. This reading will be conducted in the presence of his immediate family and designated parties. The words hung in the air, dull and procedural, yet charged with unspoken anticipation. Rita shifted in her seat, her eyes flickering toward her children. They avoided her gaze, staring instead at the polished table or the papers in front of them. The silence felt heavier than the room itself. Jack continued, reciting the preamble of the will, a list of formalities, legal jargon, and acknowledgments that made Rita's head spin. His voice droned on, the monotony broken only by the faint rustle of paper. Rita's mind wandered to the past, to the years of partnership and sacrifice she thought she had shared with Dave. She glanced at her children again, seeking some sign of solidarity, but their expressions remained impenetrable. She frowned. Why do they look so detached? She wondered, unease creeping into her thoughts. Then Jack paused, the slight hesitation in his tone breaking the rhythm. Now, on to the division of assets, he said, glancing around the table. A ripple of tension coursed through the room as everyone leaned forward, bracing for what was to come. Jack's voice remained even as he began outlining the first provisions. The sum of Dave's savings and investments will be allocated to a trust, managed for the benefit of his grandchildren, he stated. Molly and Derek exchanged brief glances but said nothing. Rita nodded faintly, her shoulders relaxing. This part seemed expected, reasonable. The attorney continued. The family home, located on 12th Street, will also be sold, with the proceeds distributed into the same trust. Rita's head snapped up. Sold? She interrupted, her voice trembling. What do you mean, sold? That's our home. My home. Jack hesitated for a moment but quickly regained his composure. These were Dave's explicit instructions, Mrs. Brown. He believed it was the best course of action to provide for future generations. The calm in Rita's expression began to crack. Her lips parted as if to argue, but Jack raised a hand, signaling her to let him continue. The life insurance policy, he said, will be awarded in full to Jennifer Sarah Jardine. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the sharp intake of Rita's breath. She stared at Jack, her face pale, as though she hadn't heard him correctly. Jennifer? She whispered, her voice rising in pitch. His assistant? Jack met her gaze, his expression neutral but firm. Yes, Mrs. Brown, Jennifer Sarah Jardine. It was Dave's express wish. Rita slammed her hands onto the table, the sudden motion causing Anne to flinch. This must be a mistake, she exclaimed. He would never do this to me, to us. Jack's voice remained calm, though a trace of pity edged into his tone. It's no mistake, Mrs. Brown. Dave was quite specific in his instructions. Rita's eyes darted toward her children, expecting outrage, confusion, something to confirm that they were as blindsided as she was. But instead she saw only resignation. Molly's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze fixed firmly on the table. Derek's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Anne looked away, her expression distant. You knew, Rita said, her voice cracking. You all knew, didn't you? Derek finally spoke, his voice low and cold. We didn't agree with everything he did, but we understood why. We? Rita demanded, her voice shaking with fury. How could you let this happen? Molly's eyes met hers at last, filled not with anger, but with something else. Disappointment. Maybe it's time you looked at yourself, Mom. Maybe then you'd understand. The words hit Rita like a slap. Her chest tightened as the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just about Dave's will. This was about something much deeper, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. Jack cleared his throat again, reclaiming the room's attention. "If there are no further interruptions," he said, "I will proceed with the remaining provisions." But Rita barely heard him. Her mind was racing, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, betrayal, and guilt. The life she thought she knew was unraveling before her eyes, and she had no idea how to stop it. As Jack's voice droned on, she sat frozen, her hands trembling. Her children's silence was louder than any accusation they could have spoken, and Jennifer's name, etched into the will like a permanent scar, echoed in her mind. Rita stared at the document in front of her, the reality sinking in with every word. Who was Dave, really? And what kind of secrets had he taken to his grave? The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Jack continued speaking, outlining the minor provisions in the will, but the words barely registered with Rita. Her mind was a storm, spinning between disbelief and anger. She glanced at her children again, hoping for some explanation, some reassurance, but none came. Instead, Derek leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His expression was a mixture of frustration and disdain. Finally, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You have no idea what you've done, do you?" The words hit Rita like a slap. Her head jerked toward him, her eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded, her voice sharp and brittle. Derek shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line, as though he were struggling to keep his emotions in check. "Dad told us everything," he said, his tone heavy with accusation. "About the lies, the betrayals, all of it." Rita's stomach twisted, her breath catching in her throat. "What lies? What betrayals?" she asked, though deep down, she already knew the answer. Molly, seated beside Derek, finally spoke, her voice cold but steady. "He loved you, Mom, but he couldn't forgive you." Rita's heart sank. The weight of Molly's words was almost unbearable. She opened her mouth to protest, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stared at her daughter, hoping to find even a sliver of compassion in her eyes. But there was none. Anne, who had been silent throughout the reading, fidgeted in her chair, her gaze fixed on the table. Rita turned to her, desperate for support. "Anne, please," she said, her voice trembling. "You understand, don't you? Whatever he told you, it's not the whole truth." Anne finally looked up, but her expression was unreadable. "We understand more than you think, Mom," she said softly. "Maybe it's you who doesn't understand." The room grew colder, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Rita felt cornered, as though the walls were closing in around her. She looked back at Jack, who was shuffling the final pages of the will with deliberate precision, as if to avoid the growing tension. "I did what I thought was right for this family," Rita said, her voice growing louder, more defensive. "Everything I did for us." Molly let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what you tell yourself? Because Dad knew the truth, and he made sure we did too." Rita stared at her, her mind racing. She wanted to lash out, to fight back, but the weight of her guilt held her down. Deep inside, she knew there was no way to undo the damage that had already been done. Before she could say another word, Jack cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "If there are no further questions," he said carefully, "this concludes the reading of the will." But for Rita, the questions were only beginning. The drive back to her empty home was silent except for the sound of rain pattering against the windshield. Rita's thoughts drifted, carrying her away from the suffocating tension of the will reading to a time that felt like a lifetime ago, a time when everything seemed so perfect, so full of promise. She could still picture Dave as he was in their early years, his easy smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, and the warmth in his voice when he said her name. Those memories shimmered in her mind, untouched by the shadow of betrayal that now loomed over her. Their first home together had been modest but filled with love. Dave would come home late from work, his tie loosened and his face flushed with exhaustion, but his arms always found their way around her. "How's my girl?" he would say, pulling her close as though she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. Rita would bury her face in his chest, inhaling the faint scent of cologne and the sharper tang of motor oil that clung to him after hours spent at his engineering firm. Those were the days when his devotion to her felt unshakable. He worked tirelessly, not because he wanted more for himself, but because he wanted to give her everything. "One day," he'd whisper to her as they lay in bed, "we'll have the life we've always dreamed of. I'll make sure of it." As the years passed, Dave's career flourished, and their modest home was replaced by the sprawling house on 12th Street. Rita had been so proud of him, so proud of the life they had built together. She threw dinner parties for his colleagues, beaming as they toasted to his success. And every night, after the guests had left, Dave would look at her with quiet gratitude. "None of this would be possible without you," he'd say, his voice soft but sincere. But even then, there were signs she had missed, or perhaps ignored. The late nights at the office became more frequent. At first, he'd call to tell her he'd be working overtime. Then the calls stopped altogether. She told herself it was the price of his ambition, of the life they were building. But there were moments, fleeting and elusive, that hinted at something deeper. She remembered catching him staring at the window once during dinner, his fork poised midair. "Dave?" she had asked, her voice cutting through the silence. He'd blinked, as though startled, and smiled. "Sorry, just thinking about work." She had believed him then. Now, that memory felt different, weighted with an unease she couldn't shake. And yet, through it all, she had loved him, or at least she thought she had. But had it been enough? Had she been enough? As the rain continued to fall, Rita realized how far they had drifted from those early days. The warmth, the trust, the connection. It had all been eroded, little by little, until there was nothing left but the wreckage of their once happy marriage. The first time it happened, Rita hadn't planned it. Or at least, that's what she told herself in the quiet moments afterward, when guilt pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. It started innocently enough. She had joined the church committee during a particularly lonely phase of her marriage. Dave was always at the office, and the children were growing older, needing her less with each passing year. She had wanted something to occupy her time, to give her days purpose again. That was where she met Brian. Brian was everything Dave wasn't, or perhaps everything Dave used to be. He was young, vibrant, and brimming with a kind of energy that made everyone around him feel like they mattered. At first, he was just kind. He noticed her in ways that no one else did anymore. "That dress looks great on you, Rita," he said one Sunday after service. "Blue really brings out your eyes." She had laughed it off, brushing it aside as nothing more than a polite compliment. But as the weeks passed, his attention became harder to ignore. He sought her out during committee meetings, leaning in close when he spoke, his voice low and conspiratorial, as though they shared a secret no one else could understand. He offered to help her carry boxes for the bake sale, lingering just a little longer than necessary when their hands brushed. The turning point came on a crisp autumn evening after a late committee meeting at the church. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the air was filled with the faint scent of fallen leaves. Brian had walked her to her car, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "You know," he said, his tone playful yet serious, "you deserve to feel alive again." The words hit her like a lightning bolt. Alive. How long had it been since she felt anything close to that? "Brian," she started, but her voice faltered. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I mean it, Rita. You're amazing. I see the way you take care of everyone else, but who's taking care of you?" For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at her, it was intoxicating. Before she could think it through, she whispered, "Just one time. That's all." And what followed was a blur of heated touches and whispered promises neither of them intended to keep. They ended up at a small motel just outside of town, the kind of place that didn't ask questions. Rita remembered the way her hands trembled as she unlocked the door, the rush of adrenaline mixed with fear and anticipation. Inside, the world outside faded away. Brian was gentle but insistent, his hands exploring her like she was something precious. For the first time in years, Rita felt seen, desired. She wasn't Dave's wife or her children's mother. She was just a woman, and in Brian's arms, she felt like she could be anything she wanted. But when it was over, the reality of what she'd done crashed down on her. As she lay next to Brian in the dimly lit room, she stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding. "I should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian propped himself up on one elbow, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to," he said softly. Rita shook her head, her chest tightening with guilt. "This was a mistake," she said, sitting up and reaching for her clothes. "It can't happen again." Brian didn't argue. He simply nodded, though the disappointment in his eyes was clear. "If that's what you want," he said. She left the motel feeling equal parts exhilarated and ashamed. In the days that followed, she avoided Brian at church, throwing herself into her family life with renewed determination. But the memory of that night lingered, a secret she carried like a weight she couldn't put down. At the time, she thought it was just one lapse in judgment, one moment of weakness. She didn't realize then how that single choice would set off a chain of events that would unravel everything she had worked so hard to protect. Dave had always trusted Rita. For years, he believed their marriage was built on a foundation strong enough to withstand anything. But that belief shattered the day he found the receipt. It was crumpled in the pocket of Rita's coat, a receipt for a motel on the edge of town. The date on it was burned into his memory, a day he thought had been unremarkable until now. His hands shook as he unfolded the paper, the weight of realization pressing down on him like a physical force. He didn't confront her. Not then, not yet. Instead, he tucked the receipt back where he found it and spent the rest of the evening in silence. The sound of Rita humming in the kitchen, the laughter of their children in the living room, it all felt distant, surreal, as if he were observing someone else's life. The next morning, he skipped work and drove to the motel. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up when Dave slid the receipt across the counter. "This room," Dave said, his voice tight. "Was it paid for in cash?" The clerk shrugged. "Don't remember." "Probably." Dave nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't need more confirmation. The truth was already suffocating him. Days turned into weeks, and the knowledge of Rita's betrayal festered inside him. He watched her more closely now, her smiles, her excuses, her late nights at church committee meetings. Every detail that once seemed innocent now felt like a lie. At night, he lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, his mind a storm of questions. Why? Wasn't I enough? Wasn't our family enough? He thought about confronting her, about demanding answers. But each time he opened his mouth, he stopped himself. The kids, Molly, Derek, Anne, they needed stability. They needed a father who could hold their world together, even as his own was falling apart. One evening, as he fixed a broken hinge on the kitchen cabinet, Molly wandered in, a book clutched to her chest. "Thanks for fixing everything, Dad," she said casually before disappearing up the stairs. Her words struck him like a punch. Fixing things, that's what he did, wasn't it? He fixed things. The house, the broken toys, the scraped knees. He looked down at the screwdriver in his hand, gripping it tightly as his chest ached with the weight of it all. "I can fix this," he told himself. "I have to." Over time, he buried his pain beneath the routine of family life. He attended Anne's school plays, clapped proudly at Molly's piano recitals, and helped Derek with his college applications. But the man they saw wasn't whole. Inside, he felt hollow, every smile an act, every laugh a lie. He confided in no one but Jack. "I need your help," Dave said, pacing Jack's office late one night. His voice was strained, his movements jerky and restless. Jack, seated behind his desk, watched him carefully. "What's going on, Dave?" Dave stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I know about Rita," he said flatly. the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Jack leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I see. And what are you planning to do?" Dave's shoulders sagged as he sank into the chair across from Jack. For a long moment, he stared at his hands. "I won't ruin their lives because of her," he said finally. His voice was quiet but firm. "But I won't let her destroy me either." Jack nodded slowly. "You've got options, Dave. You don't have to keep carrying this alone." Dave shook his head. "I'll carry it as long as I have to, for them." In the months that followed, Dave's resolve hardened. He began making arrangements, rewriting his will, setting up trusts for the children, ensuring that Rita's actions wouldn't leave them vulnerable. He poured himself into his work, not out of passion but necessity. Every late night at the office, every extra hour spent in silence was part of his plan. And yet, even as he worked to protect his family, the betrayal gnawed at him. He couldn't look at Rita without seeing the lies in her smile, the distance in her touch. One night, as they sat in the living room with the children, Dave watched Rita laugh at something Derek said. She looked so normal, so untouched by the guilt that consumed him. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. She doesn't deserve forgiveness, he thought bitterly, but he knew he would never say it out loud. Dave's silence became his armor. He stayed for the children, for the life he had built, for the family he refused to let fall apart. But deep down, he knew the cracks were already there, widening with each passing day. And so he waited, not for reconciliation, not for healing, but for the moment when he could finally walk away, leaving her to face the ruins she had created. Michael was the first. It happened a year after Dave found the receipt. Rita's affair with Brian had ended, but the void in her heart remained. That void led her to Michael, a charming contractor she met during the renovations of their kitchen. Michael was older than Brian, confident in a way that made her feel secure, yet with just enough recklessness to reignite the spark she craved. Their trysts were fleeting, stolen moments in the back seat of his truck or in empty homes he was renovating. For Rita, it was an escape, a way to reclaim the parts of herself she'd thought she'd lost. For Michael, it seemed to be little more than a passing amusement. But then, one evening, Michael's house exploded. That's when Michael really started noticing the difference. The news spread quickly. A gas leak. The blast destroyed half the block, leaving nothing but rubble and the faint scent of scorched earth. Rita found out through a panicked call from a mutual acquaintance. She sat in stunned silence, clutching the phone as the words repeated in her head. "Michael's gone." Later that night, as she lay in bed next to Dave, her mind churned with guilt and confusion. But Dave said nothing. His expression remained calm, his breathing steady. It was as if the news hadn't touched him at all. Rita convinced herself it was a tragic coincidence, nothing more. But somewhere deep inside, a sliver of doubt began to grow. Then there was Jerome. Jerome was different. He wasn't as polished as Michael, nor as youthful as Brian. He was a musician, a dreamer, someone who made her laugh when she felt she had forgotten how. Their affair began during a charity event where he played piano, and Rita, mesmerized by his talent, found herself drawn to him. For months, they met in secret, but as their relationship deepened, Jerome became bolder, less cautious. He left voicemails, sent her letters, even hinted at telling Dave. And then, one day, Jerome disappeared. And the police called it a missing persons case. There was no evidence of foul play, no sign of where he might have gone. Friends speculated he had simply skipped town, running off to chase another dream or escape some unspoken trouble. But Rita couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She remembered Dave's reaction when she mentioned Jerome's disappearance in passing. He had barely looked up from the paper, offering only a curt, "People like him don't stick around long." The comment was casual, almost dismissive, but in hindsight, it felt like something more. Yet, Mario was the last. He was a businessman Rita met through one of Dave's colleagues. Their affair was brief, marked by stolen weekends and hurried phone calls. Unlike the others, Mario was married, his own family life as fractured as hers. Rita told herself this one was different, less risky. They were both careful, aware of the stakes. But then, on a rainy night, Mario's car exploded as he drove home. The cause? A faulty fuel line. Yeah. Rita was devastated. By then, the weight of her choices was becoming unbearable. She found herself withdrawing from everyone, including Dave. She avoided his gaze, avoided his questions, if he even asked any. His silence had always been unnerving, but now it felt like something darker, something deliberate. The night of Mario's death, she sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of wine. Dave entered quietly, his footsteps soft on the carpet. He didn't speak, just stood there for a moment, watching her. "You okay?" he asked finally, his voice even. Rita nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Dave lingered for a moment longer before turning and walking away. But as he disappeared down the hallway, a chill ran down her spine. It wasn't until years later, after Dave's death, that the pieces began to fall into place. Rita sat in the attic, sorting through boxes of Dave's belongings, when she found it, a folder filled with old engineering schematics. Among them were designs for gas lines, vehicle mechanics, even demolition techniques. Dave had always been meticulous, his expertise in engineering unmatched. She had known that. But now, as she sifted through the papers, a horrifying realization dawned on her. Every detail, every incident, the gas explosion, the disappearance, the car bombing, aligned too perfectly with the knowledge Dave possessed. Her breath quickened as she stumbled across a notebook filled with notes and calculations, some of which seemed eerily familiar. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. And there it was, Michael's address, Jerome's piano schedule, and Mario's license plate number. The truth hit her like a freight train. These weren't accidents. They couldn't have been. Dave had known. He had known everything. And instead of confronting her, he had acted in silence, exacting his revenge in ways she couldn't have imagined. Her mind raced, a mixture of fear, guilt, and disbelief. She thought of the man she had shared her life with, the man who had once promised to protect her. She had betrayed him. But this was something else entirely. In the end, it wasn't the guilt that haunted her most. It was the realization that Dave had turned his love into something unrecognizable, something cold, calculated, and unrelenting. In the end, she had become the victim here, and though the peaceful state of her mind had made her feel this great sense of peace, and now she was left to grapple with the consequences of both their choices. The rain had stopped by the time they reached the gravesite, leaving behind a gray, overcast sky that felt as heavy as the air between Rita and the others. She stood a few steps back, separate from her children and the small group gathered near Dave's coffin. Her presence was tolerated at best, ignored at worst. As the pastor finished his closing prayer, Rita caught a glimpse of Jennifer stepping forward, a white flower in hand. Rita's chest tightened. Jennifer's movements were deliberate, her posture calm but resolute. She knelt by the coffin, laying the flower gently atop it, her head bowed in what seemed like genuine grief. Rita couldn't contain herself any longer. Taking a shaky step forward, she spoke, her voice cutting through the quiet. "What exactly are you doing here, Jennifer?" The words came out sharper than she intended, but the anger bubbling beneath her skin had nowhere else to go. Jennifer stood slowly, turning to face Rita with an expression that was equal parts pity and disdain. Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her tone clipped. "But I think we both know the answer." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd, and Rita could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. "You don't belong here," she snapped, her voice trembling. "This is my family, my husband." Jennifer stepped closer, her calm composure cracking just enough to reveal the raw emotion beneath. "Your husband?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You broke him, piece by piece, long before I ever came into his life. And even when he finally found someone who loved him for who he was, You still haunted him." Rita's jaw dropped. The words cut deeper than she expected, hitting nerves she had tried to bury beneath layers of denial. "You don't know what you're talking about," she managed, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Jennifer's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp and unrelenting. "Don't I? Do you think he didn't tell me? All those nights when he couldn't sleep? When he sat in silence because talking about you was too painful? He stayed for the kids, Rita. That's the only reason he didn't leave you sooner." "That's not true," Rita shot back, her voice breaking. "Dave loved me. He loved our family." Jennifer let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Loved you?" she repeated. "Do you even hear yourself? He loved the idea of you, of the family you were supposed to be. But the reality?" She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You destroyed that. You destroyed him." Rita's hands balled into fists at her sides. "You think you're so perfect," she spat. "But you were just his assistant. You had no right." "To what?" Jennifer interrupted, her voice loud and firm. "To care for him, to be there when he needed someone who didn't lie to him, cheat on him, tear him apart piece by piece." The silence that followed was deafening. Rita's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she struggled to form a response. She glanced at her children, hoping for support, but their expressions were unreadable, their gazes fixed on the ground. Jennifer pressed on, her words now filled with a quiet but undeniable fury. "You think I wanted this? To stand here, watching you pretend to grieve for a man you never really cared about? You don't even know who he was anymore. You don't deserve to." Rita felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to fight back, to defend herself, but the weight of Jennifer's accusations left her paralyzed. Instead, she whispered, "You have no idea what our marriage was like." Jennifer's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "No," she admitted, "but I know what it became. And so do you." The tension was unbearable. Molly finally stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Mom," she said, looking at Rita with a mix of sadness and frustration, "maybe you should leave." Rita's head snapped toward her daughter, her heart sinking. "Molly," she began, her voice pleading. "Don't," Molly interrupted, shaking her head. "Just don't." Jennifer stepped back, her parting words delivered with cold finality. "He deserved better than what you gave him, Rita, and deep down, you know it." As Jennifer turned and walked away, the crowd began to disperse, leaving Rita alone by the grave. Her children lingered for a moment longer before following Jennifer, their silence more damning than any words could have been. Rita stood there, staring at the coffin, the weight of the confrontation settling over her like a shroud. For the first time, she felt the full force of what she had lost. Not just Dave, but the family she had once thought would always stand by her. And as the first raindrops began to fall again, she realized she had no one to blame but herself. The silence between them was unbearable as the crowd thinned out, leaving Rita with her 3 children under the gray sky. Molly, Derek, and Anne stood together, their closeness starkly highlighting the chasm that had formed between them and their mother. Rita took a hesitant step toward them, her hands trembling, but before she could speak, Molly turned to face her. "We need to talk," Molly said, her voice steady but cold. There was no invitation in her tone, only an unyielding demand. Rita's stomach churned. She nodded slowly, following as Molly led them to a nearby bench under a tree. The rain had softened to a mist, but the weight of the moment bore down on all of them like a storm. Once seated, Molly wasted no time. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of envelopes, worn at the edges as though they'd been handled over and over. "Dad left these for us," she said, her fingers brushing the topmost envelope. Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "One for each of us, explaining his choices. Explaining you." Rita's breath hitched. "What? What do you mean?" she asked, though the answer was already forming in her mind. Molly's eyes burned with restrained anger as she handed one of the letters to Derek. "He wanted us to know the truth," she said, her voice sharp. "About everything." Egg. Derek opened his letter, scanning the first few lines. His jaw clenched as his eyes moved across the page. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with frustration. "He stayed because of us," he said, looking directly at Rita. "Not because he forgave you. Not because he loved you anymore. Just us." Rita flinched, her hand instinctively reaching for Derek's arm, but he pulled away. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't like that. I made mistakes, yes, but—" "Stop," Molly cut in, her tone icy. "You've had years to explain yourself, years to tell us the truth, but you didn't. Dad had to." Rita's eyes darted to Anne, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. The youngest of her children sat with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Anne," Rita pleaded, "you understand, don't you? I love all of you. Everything I did was for our family." Anne finally looked up, her gaze piercing. "Is that what you tell yourself?" she asked quietly. The air grew heavier as Anne pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she was steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I needed to know the truth," she began, her voice trembling. "What truth?" Rita asked, panic creeping into her tone. Anne unfolded the paper, revealing the results of a DNA test. Her hands shook as she held it out. "I took this," she said, her voice growing louder, "because I needed to know if I was his daughter or one of your lovers." Rita's world tilted. The words echoed in her mind, almost incomprehensible in their weight. "Anne, no," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you do that?" "Why?" Anne repeated, her voice rising. "Because I couldn't trust you to tell me the truth. Because Dad deserved to know if the child he stayed for, the child he loved, was even his." "Yep." Molly stepped in before Rita could respond, her tone sharp and unyielding. "Do you even realize what you put us through?" she demanded. "The secrets, the lies, the tension between you and Dad, it poisoned everything. And now, even after he's gone, we're left to clean up the mess you made." Rita's eyes filled with tears as she looked between her children, their accusations cutting deeper than any words she had heard before. "I was trying to hold this family together," she said desperately. "I didn't want you to suffer." "We were already suffering," Derek snapped, "and you made it worse. Dad deserved better than you. We deserved better." Anne took a deep breath, her voice softer now but no less devastating. "The results came back," she said, holding the paper tightly. "I'm his daughter, but the fact that I even had to question it—" Her voice broke and she looked away, unable to finish the thought. Rita reached out, tears streaming down her face. "Anne, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Stop," Anne said firmly, cutting her off. "You don't get to apologize and make this go away. You don't get to undo what you did to Dad, to us." The silence that followed was suffocating. Molly stood, her movements stiff and deliberate. "We're done here," she said, her voice flat. "Dad gave us the truth, and now we have to decide what to do with it. But you're on your own." One by one, they turned and walked away, leaving Rita alone on the bench, clutching the damp envelopes they hadn't taken. The letters felt heavier than anything she had ever held, their weight a physical reminder of the damage she had done. And as the mist turned to rain once more, Rita realized that the family she had fought so hard to protect was gone. Because of her. The rain poured harder as Rita stumbled away from the gravesite, her vision blurred by tears and the relentless sting of her children's words. Her feet moved without direction, her heels sinking into the muddy ground, but she didn't care. The whispers from the remaining mourners echoed faintly behind her, a cruel reminder of her humiliation. Her breathing came in sharp gasps as she reached the edge of the cemetery. She leaned against the wrought iron gate, her hands trembling, her knees threatening to buckle. She had come here seeking closure, hoping to find some semblance of solace in saying goodbye to Dave. Instead, she had been confronted with the raw truth. Truth she had spent years burying under layers of denial. Her mind raced, replaying every accusation, every scathing remark from her children, Molly's cold dismissal, Derek's quiet fury, Anne's heartbreaking confession. Their words had been sharper than knives, cutting away at the fragile hope she had held on to, leaving her exposed and broken. The rain soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone, but the cold didn't compare to the emptiness spreading inside her. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, vivid and unbidden. Dave sat at his desk late one night, his brow furrowed as he wrote with deliberate care. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated his face, etched with lines of pain and exhaustion. Rita had stood in the doorway, watching him, but she hadn't asked what he was doing. He hadn't noticed her either, his focus entirely on the papers in front of him. His hand paused, the pen hovering over the page. Then, with a steady exhale, he wrote, "To my children, I stayed because I loved you. To Rita, you'll know why I left." Yet, the memory snapped back into focus, leaving Rita gasping for air. She clutched the gate tighter, the weight of Dave's words pressing down on her. She hadn't understood then, but now it was painfully clear. Little did they know that the words they'd spoken, this was why he had stayed, not for love, not for forgiveness, but for the sake of the children. And in the end, even that hadn't been enough to save what they had built. As the rain continued to fall, Rita turned and walked away, her head bowed, her heart shattered. Yet, the notice came on a crisp morning, folded neatly in an envelope slid under the door of the house she had called home for over 2 decades. Rita stared at it for a long time before she found the courage to open it. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the cold, bureaucratic language. The house was no longer hers. Dave's will had been clear. The house would be sold, the proceeds placed in a trust for their grandchildren. The thought of strangers walking through her home, appraising every inch of the life she had built, made her stomach turn. But she had no say in the matter. The home was no longer hers to keep, or to fight for. By the end of the month, Rita found herself standing outside a small, dingy apartment on the edge of town. It was the place Dave had arranged for her in his will, a final gesture of obligation rather than love. The apartment was a far cry from the spacious, welcoming home she had once cherished. The walls were yellowed with age, the floors scuffed and uneven, and the air carried the faint, unpleasant smell of mildew. As she unpacked her few remaining belongings, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Her children no longer spoke to her. Her friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to be drawn into the drama of her fractured family. And now, she was alone in a place that felt more like a punishment than a refuge. And at first, she tried to busy herself with routines, clinging to small fragments of normalcy. But the silence of the apartment was deafening, and her thoughts quickly turned inward. Every corner seemed to echo with memories she couldn't escape. Dave's laughter ringing through their old kitchen, the warmth of his hand on hers during family dinners, the quiet nights when he had stayed up late working, unaware of the secrets she was keeping. And then, inevitably, her mind would wander to the others. Brian with his boyish charm and fleeting promises. Michael, whose kindness had been snuffed out in a tragic explosion. Jerome and Mario, their lives marked by mysterious ends that now carried an unbearable weight. The guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, and with every passing day, her resolve weakened. The first drink was an attempt to numb the pain. A single glass of wine, poured with shaking hands as she sat in the tiny kitchen, staring at the stack of unopened envelopes from her children. The letters taunted her, their silence louder than any accusations could have been. But one glass turned into 2, then 3, and soon the empty bottles began to pile up in the corner of the apartment. Alcohol became her escape, a way to dull the sharp edges of her guilt and regret. She stopped answering phone calls, even though they were few and far between. The curtains in her apartment stayed drawn, blocking out the daylight that only served to remind her of everything she had lost. The isolation deepened, and with it came a spiral of self-destruction. Her once pristine appearance began to slip, her hair unkempt, her clothes wrinkled and stained, her days blurred into nights, marked only by the sound of the liquor bottle cracking open. Every so often, she would catch a glimpse of herself in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. Her reflection was gaunt, her eyes hollow, haunted by the weight of her choices. One evening, as she sat on the worn couch, clutching a nearly empty bottle, a memory surfaced unbidden. It was of Dave, standing in their old living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows. He had been fixing something, a lamp, she thought, and when he finished, he turned to her and smiled. "You're my whole world," he had said, his voice filled with quiet sincerity. The memory hit her like a punch to the gut. She sobbed, clutching the bottle tighter, the weight of her grief and shame threatening to crush her. In her darkest moments, she wondered if this was the life Dave had intended for her when he arranged the apartment. A prison of her own making, where every wall, every object, every moment reminded her of what she had destroyed. And as the days turned into weeks, Rita realized that she had lost more than her home, her family, and her dignity. She had lost herself. It was a rainy afternoon when Rita stumbled across the voicemail. She had been rummaging through an old drawer in the small, cramped apartment, searching for a pen to jot down a note. The drawer was a chaotic mess of forgotten items, a tangle of cords, old receipts, and a dusty phone she hadn't used in years. Her hand paused as she pulled the phone free, its weight oddly familiar, yet foreign after so much time. The screen was cracked, the battery nearly dead, but as she powered it on, the device blinked to life with a faint vibration. A notification flashed. A notification flashed. Finally, the door began to slide open. Rita frowned. She hadn't used this phone in ages. Curiosity mingled with apprehension as she pressed play. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Rita," Dave's voice. Her breath caught in her throat. She gripped the edge of the counter as the words continued. "I don't know if you'll ever hear this," he began, his tone steady but heavy with emotion. "But I needed to say it, even if I never had the chance to in person." The air seemed to leave the room as she listened, the sound of his voice both a comfort and a dagger to her heart. "I loved you once, Rita," Dave said, his voice soft, almost tender. "I loved you with everything I had, but you killed that love, little by little, with every lie, every betrayal. You turned what we had into something unrecognizable." Tears welled in Rita's eyes, her chest tightening with each word. "I stayed," he continued, his voice hardening. "I stayed for the kids, for the life we built. But I couldn't stay for you, not anymore. And now you're left with what you made of yourself." The message ended abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. For a moment, Rita couldn't move. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, the weight of his words crashing over her like a tidal wave. She felt exposed, as though he had reached through time and peeled back every layer she had used to shield herself from the truth. Dave's silence had always confused her, frustrated her. She had spent years wondering why he hadn't confronted her, why he hadn't demanded answers or shouted accusations. Now, she understood. His silence had been deliberate. It had been his punishment. By saying nothing, by letting her unravel under the weight of her own guilt, Dave had ensured that she would feel the full impact of her choices. Rita sank onto the floor, the phone still glowing faintly beside her. She stared at the cracked screen, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though the words felt empty. The voicemail echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the man she had once loved, and the man she had lost forever. Dave had left her nothing but the truth, and now, as she sat alone in the suffocating silence of her apartment, she realized it was the only thing he owed her. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint ticking of an old clock hanging crookedly on the wall. Rita sat in her worn armchair, a blanket draped over her shoulders, though it did little to stave off the chill that seemed to seep from within her. The once vibrant woman who had commanded attention in any room was now a mere shadow, her skin pale, her eyes hollow. She stared at the unopened envelope on the table before her. the last letter Dave had left for her. Days had turned into weeks, yet she couldn't bring herself to read it. The weight of what it might say was more than she could bear. After the voicemail, she wasn't sure she could handle more of Dave's truth. Her hands trembled as she reached for her glass. The bitter sting of the liquor offered little comfort, but it dulled the edges of her thoughts just enough to keep them at bay. Yet, no amount of alcohol could erase the memories that haunted her. The laughter of her children, the warmth of Dave's smile, the love that had once filled her life. Now, all of it was gone. She thought of Dave often, though not as the man she had betrayed. Instead, she thought of the man who had loved her unconditionally, who had built a life with her, brick by brick, only to watch her tear it apart. She thought of the quiet pain he must have endured, the stoic silence he maintained as he watched the family he cherished crumble around him. She had destroyed him, she realized, not with a single act, but with countless choices, each one chipping away at the foundation of their marriage until there was nothing left. And in the end, he had destroyed her too, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with the truth. Her children no longer called. She couldn't blame them. She had seen the way they looked at her that day at the cemetery, their eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and pity. Whatever bond they had once shared was irreparably severed. She had wanted so desperately to hold her family together, but her actions had done the opposite. She had poisoned the very foundation of their lives, leaving behind a legacy of pain and betrayal. And the unopened envelope seemed to mock her now, a silent testament to the finality of what had been lost. Slowly, she reached for it, her fingers brushing the paper. She hesitated, then pulled her hand back. She wasn't ready. Not yet.